There are stories that survive because people refuse to let them die. And there are stories that survive only because they failed to disappear completely. This is one of those stories. What happened in rural Louisiana in the middle of the 19th century was not forgotten because it was unclear. It was buried because the truth was unbearable, and because acknowledging it would have exposed a system that depended on looking away. Nothing about it announced itself as a crime at first. There were no screams recorded in court documents, no trials, no public reckoning. What appeared instead were small, unsettling details that accumulated slowly. Birth records that raised quiet questions. Children whose faces did not match the histories written beside their names. Women who grew silent, who avoided eye contact, who carried something heavy they could not speak aloud. Men who requested transfers, abandoned families, and refused to explain why. Each detail, on its own, was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern that felt wrong long before it was understood. When the explanation finally emerged, it did not bring relief. It brought dread, not because it was shocking, but because it was deliberate. A respected doctor, women who had no legal right to refuse, a law that did not recognize them as people. What happened was not hidden in the shadows. It unfolded openly, protected not by secrecy, but by legality. What makes this story so difficult is not only the acts themselves, but the way every institution examined them and turned away. The law did not fail to act. It chose not to. The courts did not misunderstand the evidence. They rejected its relevance. Justice was not denied by accident. It was excluded by design. And the consequences did not end when the man responsible left town. They lived on in children who carried the evidence in their skin, their hair, their eyes. They lived on in mothers who tried to love while carrying unbearable memory. They lived on in families torn apart by shame, disbelief, and fear. The past did not stay in the past. It followed them into every day that came after. To understand what happened, outrage is not enough. Anger alone cannot explain how something so extreme could be so thoroughly permitted. This is not a story about a single villain. It is a story about a system that made cruelty ordinary, that reduced human beings to property, and then protected those who used them. What follows is not rumor. It is not legend. It is a reconstruction built from records, testimony, and patterns that remain visible even now. Once those pieces are placed together, the picture they form is impossible to ignore. And once you see it, you cannot look away. No one asked the women what they remembered. No one recorded the nights they stopped sleeping, or the way their bodies learned fear before their minds could name it. When the story of what happened in rural Louisiana began to circulate, it was told through ledgers, meetings, and legal opinions. But the truth began somewhere else entirely. In cabins where women lay awake listening for footsteps, in mornings when they realized something irreversible had been taken from them, in the long silence that followed, because silence was safer than speaking. At first, there was no language for what had happened. There could not be. The women who carried it were not recognized as people in the eyes of the law, only as property whose value could be measured, transferred, and accounted for. What was done to them did not qualify as a crime, so it was never described as one. It existed only as memory, as fear carried in the body, as something that could not be named without punishment. Months later, the consequences began to appear in ways no one could fully hide. Pregnancies that did not make sense. Children born with faces that startled even those who loved them. Mothers who held their babies and felt two opposing truths at once, instinctive love and unbearable grief. Each child was innocent, and each child was also a reminder of violation that could not be spoken aloud. Some women tried to pretend nothing had changed. They returned to work. They followed routines. They learned how to hold their faces still. Others withdrew, becoming quiet in ways that unsettled those around them, not because they were broken, but because speaking required a language the world refused to give them. There were no questions they could answer safely. There were no explanations that would not turn against them. The children felt it before they understood it. They felt it in the way their mothers sometimes stiffened when touched. They felt it in the way eyes lingered on them too long. in the way other women watched with pity or suspicion. They felt it in the absence of fathers who suddenly disappeared, who refused to look at them, who treated their existence as something shameful rather than something that demanded protection. For the mothers, there was no resolution. There was only endurance. They raised children who carried the evidence of what had been done to them in their skin and hair. They loved as best they could while carrying memories that never softened. They navigated a world that blamed them for their own suffering, that questioned their virtue instead of the system that stripped them of choice. This story is often told through records and outcomes, through dates and patterns. But those records exist because of women who survived long enough to give birth, long enough to keep their children alive, long enough to endure the consequences of something they had no power to refuse. Their suffering did not end when the axe stopped. It continued in the daily labor of living with what could not be undone. What follows is not only an account of injustice written into law. It is the story of women whose humanity was denied so completely that even their pain was considered irrelevant. Understanding what happened requires starting there, with the people who were never meant to be heard, whose voices were never preserved, and whose lives were altered in ways no record can fully capture. Because before there were patterns, before there were meetings, before there were children whose existence raised questions, there were women who understood something terrible had been done to them, and who were forced to carry that knowledge alone. At first, the women did not compare notes. Comparison was dangerous. Speaking too openly invited punishment, suspicion, or worse. Each woman carried her fear privately, assuming it belonged only to her. The visits came at different times. The circumstances were never discussed openly, but the aftermath was the same. A sudden awareness of vulnerability. A sense that something had shifted permanently, that a boundary had been crossed and erased. Pregnancy arrived quietly, then all at once. For some, it was recognized early. For others, it was denied until denial became impossible. Pregnancy under enslavement was not unusual, but this was different. The timing did not align with the men recorded as partners. The fear was not about bearing a child. It was about what the child would reveal. Each woman understood, long before anyone else did, that her body was carrying evidence. As their bodies changed, the weight of watching grew heavier. Other women noticed. Overseers noticed. Questions began to surface, cautiously at first, framed as concern or curiosity. The women learned quickly how to answer without answering. They learned how to lower their eyes, how to keep their voices steady, how to survive scrutiny without confession. Confession implied choice. There had been none. When the children were born, silence became impossible. The first pale-skinned infant startled everyone present. The midwives said nothing at first. They did not need to. The room already understood. Word spread quickly, not with outrage, but with disbelief. Explanations were offered and dismissed. Coincidence was suggested, then abandoned. When the second child was born, and then another, denial collapsed under its own weight. For the mothers, childbirth did not bring relief. It brought exposure. Their pain was no longer private. It lived in the cradle beside them. Some women wept openly. Others went rigid, their faces unreadable. They were expected to return to work quickly, to function as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everything had changed. Their children were watched constantly. Their own movements were monitored more closely than before. They were no longer just enslaved women. They were living contradictions, proof that something had gone wrong in a system that claimed order. Marie tried to protect Claire from this attention. She kept her close, shielded her from stares when she could. She sang to her at night, not only to soothe the child, but to steady herself. But there were moments when she could not stop herself from pulling away, when memory intruded without warning. Love did not erase trauma. It existed alongside it, tangled and painful. Other mothers struggled to form any attachment at all. Holding their children meant reliving what had been done to them. Feeding them meant acknowledging a future they had not chosen. Some women felt guilt for this distance, guilt layered atop violation, as though they were failing at something no one should have been forced into. The children grew quickly, and with them grew unease. They were not treated like other children. They were watched, measured, discussed. Their features were commented on openly, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with resentment. They learned early that attention did not mean care. They learned that curiosity could feel like threat. They learned to stay close to their mothers, even when closeness was complicated. The men who had been paired with the women did not respond with protection. They responded with withdrawal. Shame and anger mixed in ways that often turned cruel. Some accused the women of betrayal. Others refused to speak to them at all. The children became symbols of humiliation rather than responsibility. Transfers were requested, granted. Lives were rearranged to restore comfort, not for the women, but for the men who could not tolerate the reminder of their powerlessness within a system that still benefited them. Inside the quarters, tension deepened. Sympathy competed with suspicion. Some believed the women had been targeted precisely because they were seen as compliant, as safe. Others understood that no one truly safe could exist in such a system. The community fractured subtly, not through open conflict, but through distance, through whispers, through the quiet sorting of who could be trusted. Through all of this, the man at the center of it remained largely invisible to the women themselves. Levine did not appear monstrous in daily life. He did not shout or threaten. He arrived, observed, recorded, and left. His authority was assumed, not enforced. That made it more dangerous. He did not need to explain himself to the women, because the law had already explained them away. By the time the pattern became undeniable to those with power, the women already knew it intimately. They had lived it. They had carried it. They had given birth to it. What followed, the meetings, the arguments, the legal inquiries, unfolded far above their heads. Decisions were debated by men who would never sit in a cabin at night, holding a child who looked nothing like them and everything like the worst moment of their lives. And when those debates ended without consequence, the women were not surprised. They had never been protected before. As the children grew, so did the discomfort of those who benefited most from pretending nothing was wrong. What had begun as whispers among the women could no longer be contained within the quarters. Plantation owners noticed the stares their guests lingered on too long. Visitors asked questions that were brushed away too quickly. A system built on control relies on predictability, and these children represented something unpredictable, evidence that authority had been used in a way that threatened the illusion of order. Meetings were called, not in outrage, but in irritation. The concern was never centered on the women or the children. It was centered on reputation, on property value, on the possibility that rumors, if left unmanaged, could invite unwanted attention from outside the parish. The discussion was framed carefully, stripped of moral language. What mattered was not what had happened, but how visible it had become. Levine was spoken of cautiously. He had been useful, reliable, trusted, a man whose profession placed him above suspicion by default. Accusations against someone like him felt disruptive, even impolite. To question him was to question the judgment of everyone who had relied on his expertise. That made the idea of wrongdoing inconvenient rather than urgent. When Levine was finally confronted, it was not with anger, but with concern. He did not deny what was implied. He redirected it. He spoke calmly, precisely, as someone accustomed to being believed. He framed his actions as necessity, as observation, as something misunderstood by those unfamiliar with medical reasoning. He never spoke of the women as people. He spoke of them as cases. That language mattered. It reassured the men listening. It allowed them to categorize what they were hearing as technical rather than criminal. If this was science, then it belonged in discussion, not punishment. If this was medicine, then discomfort was simply the cost of progress. For the women, none of this was visible. What they noticed instead were changes in routine. Levine's visits became less frequent, then resumed without explanation. Some women were moved to different plantations. Others were kept closer than before. The uncertainty itself became a form of control. Not knowing what would happen next was often worse than knowing something bad would. The children sensed the shift before they understood it. They felt it in the way adults stopped speaking when they entered a room. They felt it in the way they were excluded from games, from lessons, from spaces that had once been open to them. They were not punished openly. They were erased quietly. Marie watched this happen to Claire and felt a new kind of fear take hold. Not the fear of violation, but the fear of inheritance. She worried not only about what had been done to her, but about what the world would do to her child because of it. She could protect Claire from some things, harsh words, wandering hands, certain gazes, but she could not protect her from the conclusions others drew simply by looking at her. At night, Marie told Claire stories that had nothing to do with where they were. Stories about places where children were valued because they existed, not because they were useful. She did this not because she believed those places were real, but because she needed Claire to believe in something beyond the world that had already marked her. Other mothers did the same in quieter ways. They braided hair carefully. They corrected posture gently. They taught their children how to disappear when necessary, how to make themselves small in the presence of power. These were not lessons anyone should have to teach a child, but they were survival lessons, passed down without ceremony. Eventually, the matter reached the courts, not because justice demanded it, but because ignoring it any longer risked disorder. The case was framed narrowly. Evidence was filtered. The women were not called to testify. Their accounts were considered unreliable by default. The children themselves were treated as anomalies rather than outcomes. The court acknowledged that something unusual had occurred. It stopped short of naming it. To name it would have required redefining harm in a system that could not afford to do so. Instead, the ruling focused on technicalities, on jurisdiction, on definitions that conveniently excluded enslaved women from protection. Levine was not convicted. He was not punished. He was quietly removed from his position, allowed to continue his life elsewhere. The decision was presented as resolution. For the women, it felt like confirmation of what they had always known. Nothing in the system was built for them. The children grew into that truth. They learned that justice was selective, that harm could be documented and still dismissed. They learned that their existence unsettled people, not because of what they had done, but because of what they revealed. Some internalized that shame. Others hardened against it. None escaped it entirely. Years later, records would describe the case in restrained language, stripped of emotion. Dates, names, outcomes. What those records could not capture was the cost paid every day by women who had been forced to live with memories no one else wanted to acknowledge, and by children who carried a history they never chose. The story did not end when the court adjourned. It ended slowly, in fragments, when mothers died without ever being believed, when children left the plantations carrying questions no one would answer, when silence became the final verdict. And that silence, more than any ruling, revealed the truth of the system that allowed it all to happen. Marie learned very quickly that survival after the violation did not look like recovery. There was no return to who she had been before, no moment where the world softened and allowed her to heal. Instead, life narrowed. Her days became smaller, quieter, arranged around the fragile gravity of one child who had arrived carrying both innocence and consequence in the same breath. Claire was born just before dawn. Marie remembered the way the light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, pale and uncertain, as if the morning itself hesitated to witness what had been brought into the world. When the midwife placed the baby in her arms, Marie felt a rush of relief, so strong it almost knocked the air from her lungs. Claire was warm. She was alive, she cried. For a brief, dangerous moment, Marie allowed herself to believe that love might be enough to undo what had been done. Then she saw her face. The hair was almost white, soft and fine against Marie's dark skin. The eyes, when they finally opened, were an impossible blue, bright, searching, already asking questions the world was not prepared to answer. Marie felt her body stiffen, not because she did not love the child, but because she recognized immediately what Claire would mean, not just to her, but to everyone who saw her. From that moment on, Marie lived in two states at once. There was the instinctive pull toward her child, the fierce tenderness that rose every time Claire whimpered or reached for her, and there was the constant, aching reminder of the night that had created her. These two truths never reconciled. They existed side by side, grinding against each other, wearing Marie down slowly. She tried, at first, to pretend that Claire's appearance did not matter. She told herself that babies changed, that features shifted with time. But as the weeks passed, Claire only grew more visibly different. Other women noticed. They said nothing outright, but Marie saw it in their expressions, in the way conversations paused when she approached, in the looks that lingered a second too long on Claire's face. Marie stopped bringing Claire out unless she had to. She kept her close, wrapped tight against her chest, as if hiding her might somehow protect her. At night, she held Claire until her arms ached, terrified that if she let go, even for a moment, the world would claim her in ways Marie could not stop. Sleep became difficult. When Claire finally drifted off, Marie lay awake, listening to her breathing, haunted by memories she could not escape. The sounds of the plantation at night, the creak of wood, the distant calls, the rustle of footsteps, pulled her back to that other night, the one she never spoke of. Sometimes she would wake gasping, clutching Claire so tightly the baby cried in protest, confused by a fear she could not understand. As Claire grew, the distance between her and the other children widened. They played together at first, unaware of difference, until someone older corrected them. Marie watched as invitations stopped coming, as games shifted just far enough away that Claire was no longer included. No one explained why. They didn't have to. Children learn exclusion quickly. Claire didn't ask questions at first. She accepted her mother's presence as the center of her world. Marie was grateful for that. It allowed her to delay the inevitable. But by the time Claire was 4, she began to notice the way others stared. She noticed the whispers, the way some adults avoided her entirely, while others examined her with uncomfortable curiosity. "Why do they look at me like that?" Claire asked one evening, her voice small but steady. Marie froze. There were so many truths she could not give her child, so many explanations that would only hurt. She chose the only one that felt survivable. "Because you're different," she said softly, "and people don't always know how to be kind about that." Claire considered this in silence. Then she nodded, as if difference were simply another fact to carry. Marie felt both pride and guilt in that moment. Pride that her daughter was strong enough to accept what the world offered her. Guilt that the world offered her so little. As Claire's features sharpened with age, new dangers emerged. Marie noticed the way certain men looked at her daughter, not with confusion, but with interest. It terrified her more than anything else. Claire was still a child, but Marie knew how quickly that distinction could be erased. She began keeping Claire indoors more often, assigning her small tasks just to justify her absence from view. Claire didn't understand the fear behind these rules. She only felt the confinement. Sometimes she resented it. Sometimes she cried. Marie absorbed that pain without protest. If Claire needed someone to be angry with, Marie would bear it. That was easier than risking what might happen if she didn't. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Marie allowed herself to imagine another life for her daughter. A place where Claire's appearance was not a liability, where no one knew the circumstances of her birth, where she could simply be a child. Those thoughts were both comforting and cruel. They offered hope while reminding Marie how unreachable it was. As years passed, Marie noticed a change in herself. The sharpness of her grief dulled, replaced by something heavier, a constant vigilance. She no longer expected justice. She no longer expected acknowledgement. All she wanted was time. Enough time to teach Claire how to survive in a world that had already decided who she was. Marie taught her to read expressions, to sense danger before it arrived. She taught her when to speak and when silence was safer. She taught her how to carry herself, how to avoid drawing attention, how to endure being misunderstood without internalizing it. These were lessons passed down without words, learned through observation and necessity. Claire grew into a quiet, watchful child. She loved her mother deeply, though she never fully understood the sadness that lived behind Marie's eyes. She sensed it, felt its weight, but could not name it. Sometimes she would press her face against Marie's chest and listen to her heartbeat, as if trying to anchor herself to something solid. Marie treasured those moments. They reminded her that despite everything, something unbroken still existed between them. But even love had limits under a system designed to deny it meaning. Marie knew she could not protect Claire forever. She could only prepare her. And that knowledge, the countdown implicit in every year that passed, was its own quiet form of suffering. This was the true aftermath of what had been done. Not just the act itself, but the lifetime of fear, restraint, and adaptation that followed. The way one violation reshaped two lives entirely. The way a mother learned to live with both love and loss wrapped into the same child. Claire was old enough to know when something was being kept from her long before anyone ever admitted it. Truth leaves a shape even when it isn't spoken. It gathers in pauses, in the way adults redirect conversations, in the tension that rises whenever a certain name is mentioned. By the time she was 7, Claire understood that there was a story about her that did not belong to her, one that lived just out of reach. The first crack appeared in something small, a careless remark from another child, repeated without malice but heavy with meaning. "You don't look like your mama," the girl said one afternoon, not accusing, just curious. Claire shrugged at first. She had heard that before. But then the girl added, "My mama says that's because you got a different kind of father." Claire didn't ask anything else. She went home with the words pressing against her chest, uncomfortable and sharp. That night, she watched Marie more closely than she ever had. The lines in her face seemed deeper, the quiet sadness more deliberate. Claire wondered how long her mother had been carrying something alone. She waited days before asking. Children sense when a question is dangerous, even if they don't know why. When she finally spoke, it was almost casual, as if she were afraid that giving the question weight would make it real. "Who was my father?" Marie's hands stopped moving, not abruptly, slowly, as if her body needed time to decide what to do with the question before her mind could catch up. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the small fire burning low. "I don't know," Marie said. It was not a lie, not in the way Claire understood lying. But it was not the truth either. Claire accepted the answer outwardly, but something shifted inside her. She began to notice how her question lingered in the air long after it was spoken, how Marie avoided her eyes afterward, how her voice carried a tremor it hadn't before. Claire learned then that some truths hurt the people who loved you, and that learning them came at a cost. The real understanding arrived later, piece by piece, in fragments that could not be gathered all at once. A look exchanged between adults when Claire entered a room, a sudden silence when she passed by, the way her name carried weight in places where other children's names did not. The moment that broke the illusion came one evening when Claire overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. Two women speaking in low voices outside the cabin, believing her asleep. Claire lay still, listening, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. "She looks just like him," one of them said. Marie's name followed, then a man's, not her father's name, a doctor's. The word doctor should not have felt dangerous, but it did. It landed wrong. Claire felt a cold settle in her stomach. "What he did was wrong," the other woman said. "But wrong doesn't mean punished." Claire didn't hear the rest. She couldn't. Her mind seized on the implication and refused to let go. She stayed awake the entire night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fragments until they formed something she did not yet have words for. The next morning, she looked at her mother differently, not with suspicion, but with fear. Fear of what Marie might tell her. Fear of what she already knew. Days passed before Claire spoke again. When she did, her voice was careful, almost adult in its restraint. "Did someone hurt you?" Marie closed her eyes. The silence that followed was the longest Claire had ever known. It stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Claire wondered if she had broken something that could never be fixed. "Yes," Marie said finally. That single word changed everything. It rearranged Claire's understanding of herself, of her mother, of the world they lived in. It was not an explanation. It was an admission, and it was enough. Claire did not ask for details. She did not need them. The truth settled into her bones in a way that felt permanent. She understood now why her mother watched her so closely, why fear lived behind love, why her existence carried an unspoken weight. "Was it my fault?" Claire asked. Marie's answer came immediately, fierce and unrestrained. No, never. She pulled Claire into her arms with a force that startled them both. Claire felt her mother's body shake, felt the grief that had been held back for years finally surface. This was not the controlled sorrow Marie usually allowed herself. This was raw, uncontrolled, and terrifying in its honesty. Claire cried too, though she did not fully understand why. She only knew that something fragile had been named, and that naming it had cost them both. After that, nothing was quite the same. Claire moved through the world with new awareness. She noticed how easily people looked away from suffering once it became inconvenient. She noticed how silence functioned as protection, not for the vulnerable, but for those in power. She also noticed her mother's strength more clearly, not as something heroic or grand, but as endurance, as the daily choice to wake up, to care, to love, despite the knowledge of how easily love could be weaponized against them. Claire began to feel anger where confusion had once lived, not just for herself, but for her mother, for what had been taken and never acknowledged. That anger had nowhere to go. It had no language, no outlet, no permission to exist. So she carried it quietly, the way her mother had carried her pain. This understanding marked the end of Claire's childhood. From that point on, she was not simply growing older. She was becoming someone shaped by a truth that could never be undone. And yet, even in this knowledge, something tender remained. Claire loved her mother, not in spite of the truth, but because of it. Because she now understood what it had cost Marie to keep her safe, to keep her loved, to keep her human in a world that refused to do so. This was the inheritance no record ever captured. Not the features, not the lineage, not the scandal, but the quiet transmission of pain and resilience from one generation to the next. Marie had known this moment would come, long before Claire ever asked the question. She had felt it approaching the way one feels a storm days before it breaks, in the pressure of the air, in the restlessness of birds, in the unease that settles into the body without explanation. Still, knowing did not make it easier. It only made the waiting heavier. After Claire spoke, after the truth was acknowledged without being fully spoken, Marie felt something inside her shift. Not release, not relief, something more complicated. A loosening that hurt. For years, she had carried the weight of that night alone, believing that silence was the only protection she could offer her child. Now that silence was broken, and Marie had to live with what followed, she watched Claire closely in the days that came after. The child moved differently, quieter, more observant, as if the world had suddenly become less predictable. Marie recognized that look. It was the same one she had seen in her own reflection years earlier. The look of someone who has learned that safety is conditional. Guilt crept in alongside fear. Not because Marie believed she had done anything wrong, but because she had passed something unbearable to her child simply by surviving. She wondered if she had been selfish to keep Claire close, to raise her herself, to love her so openly in a place that punished vulnerability. These thoughts came late at night, when exhaustion stripped away her defenses. Marie replayed that night again and again. Not the violence itself, but the aftermath. The disbelief in people's eyes when she tried to speak. The way concern turned into discomfort, then into avoidance. She remembered learning that what had happened to her did not fit into the language of crime, that the law had no words for her pain. That realization had been more devastating than the act itself. She had sworn then that Claire would never learn that lesson too young. Now watching her daughter carry a piece of that understanding, Marie felt both grief and resolve sharpen into something harder. She could not undo the truth, but she could shape how Claire lived with it. She began to speak differently to her, more directly, more honestly, though still carefully. She spoke of dignity, of worth that did not depend on how others defined you. These were not abstract lessons. They were armor. Marie also felt anger resurface. Stronger than it had been in years. It had never disappeared, only buried beneath necessity. Seeing Claire's innocence fracture reopened something raw. Marie realized how much energy she had spent making herself smaller so that others would remain comfortable. That instinct no longer served her. Not now. She stopped lowering her eyes when certain men passed. She stopped apologizing with her posture. These were small rebellions, invisible to most, but they mattered to her. Claire noticed too. She watched her mother stand a little straighter, speak a little more firmly. It gave her something solid to hold on to. Still, fear lingered. Marie understood better than anyone how quickly curiosity could turn predatory. She doubled her vigilance, measuring every interaction, every look directed at her daughter. Love in this world required constant alertness. There were moments when Marie felt close to breaking, when the weight of years pressed down so hard she could barely breathe. In those moments, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for what had been done to her, but for the life Claire would never have, a life free from explanation, from suspicion, from inherited pain. But grief did not stop her. It sharpened her sense of purpose. Marie resolved that Claire would know her own worth, even if the world refused to recognize it. That she would understand that what defined her was not the circumstances of her birth, but the strength with which she endured what followed. Marie could not give her justice. She could give her truth, and with it, the tools to survive. This was the quiet defiance that sustained her. Not loud resistance, not rebellion that invited punishment, but the insistence on seeing herself and her child as fully human in a system designed to deny them that status. Years later, when people spoke of these women only as victims, Marie wished they could understand this part. That survival was not passive, that every day she chose to love her child openly was an act of courage, that raising Claire with honesty, even when it hurt, was a form of resistance. This was Marie's legacy, not recorded in ledgers or journals, not acknowledged by courts or laws, but lived, day after day, in the space between fear and love. And it was enough to carry them forward. By the time Claire reached 12, Marie understood that childhood had been something borrowed, not promised. The changes came quietly at first, the way danger often does. Claire grew taller, her body lengthening, her features sharpening into something that drew attention whether she wanted it or not. Her hair lightened in the sun. Her eyes, once merely noticeable, now unsettled people. She could feel it before she could name it. The shift in how the world looked at her. Marie saw it too, and it terrified her. Men who had once ignored Claire entirely now noticed her presence. Their gazes lingered just a second too long. Their voices softened in ways that had nothing to do with kindness. Marie began to recognize the signs instinctively, the same way prey recognizes the movement of a predator before danger fully reveals itself. She positioned herself between Claire and others whenever possible, inventing errands, assigning chores, keeping her daughter close. Claire resented this at first. She was old enough now to want space, to want the small freedoms she saw other girls allowed. She didn't yet understand that what Marie called protection was also grief in motion. Every rule Marie enforced was built on memory. "You don't trust me," Claire said once, her voice sharp with frustration. Marie wanted to tell her that trust had nothing to do with it, that danger did not require invitation. But how do you explain to a child that the world has already decided something about her body, her value, her availability? Instead, Marie said only, "I trust you, I don't trust them." That answer followed Claire longer than she expected. As Claire moved into adolescence, the distance between her and others widened again, but differently this time. She was no longer excluded out of confusion. She was isolated out of calculation. Other women watched her carefully, some with pity, others with suspicion, a few with envy. Claire learned quickly that beauty, especially a kind of beauty that did not belong where it appeared, was not a gift. It was a liability. She also learned that attention was rarely neutral. Claire became quieter, more guarded. She learned how to fold herself inward, how to dull her presence just enough to feel safer. She wore her hair covered when she could. She avoided eye contact. These were strategies she developed without instruction. Marie recognized them because she had learned the same ones years earlier. There were moments when Marie caught Claire watching her, studying her expressions the way Marie had once studied the world. It broke something in her to realize that her daughter was becoming fluent in fear. Still, Claire was not only afraid, she was also curious. Adolescence brought questions that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with identity. Who she was allowed to be, what parts of herself were forbidden. Whether the truth of her origins defined her future or merely explained her past, she noticed, now more than ever, how differently she was treated from other girls. Some were paired off early, encouraged into relationships that mirrored their parents. Claire was not. No one spoke openly about her prospects. It was as if the community could not decide where she belonged, so it placed her nowhere. That uncertainty followed her everywhere. It shaped her sense of self more than any direct cruelty could have. Being unwanted was one thing. Being unplaceable was another. Marie sensed Claire pulling away in small ways, spending longer alone, asking fewer questions, holding her thoughts closer to her chest. This frightened Marie more than open rebellion would have. Silence, she knew, could be dangerous. Silence was how harm hid. One evening, after Claire returned later than expected, Marie confronted her, not angrily, desperately. "Where were you?" she asked. Claire hesitated, just long enough for Marie's heart to race. "I was walking," Claire said. "I just needed air." Marie believed her, and yet, fear flooded her anyway. Because needing air was often the first sign that a person felt trapped. That night, Marie lay awake thinking about how protection changes as children grow, how the walls you build to keep danger out can become cages if left standing too long. She realized that she was reaching the limit of what she could control. That frightened her more than anything else. The world beyond the plantation loomed larger now. Rumors circulated about traders, about buyers who valued girls with Claire's appearance for reasons Marie did not want to articulate. She had seen what happened to other girls, ones who disappeared quietly, their absence explained in euphemisms that meant nothing good. Marie began planning without ever naming it as such. She considered escape, relocation, any path that might remove Claire from visibility. Each option carried its own risks. The system was designed to make movement costly. Freedom was not just denied, it was dangerous to pursue. Claire sensed the tension, even when Marie tried to hide it. One night she asked softly, "Are we going to be okay?" Marie did not answer immediately. She took Claire's hands in hers, feeling how much they had changed, how close they were to being hands the world would try to claim. "We will do everything we can," Marie said. It was not a promise. It was a commitment. Claire leaned into her mother then, resting her head against Marie's shoulder. In that moment, adolescence receded, and she was a child again, seeking reassurance in the only place that had ever felt safe. Marie held her tightly, knowing that these moments were becoming rare. This was the edge of something irreversible, the point where love alone could no longer shield a child from the consequences of a system built on exploitation. Marie felt the familiar anger rise again, sharper now, fueled not just by memory but by fear for the future. Adolescence, Marie realized, was not just a passage of time. It was a test of endurance, of restraint, of how much a mother could carry before the weight became unbearable. And the test was far from over. It began with rumors, the way all dangerous things did. Nothing direct, nothing that could be named or confronted. Just fragments carried on low voices and sideways glances. Men who did not usually come near the quarters lingered longer than necessary. Conversations stopped when Marie passed. The air itself seemed to tighten around Claire, as if the world were slowly deciding something about her without asking. Marie felt it first in her body, a tightening in her chest, a restlessness that kept her awake at night. She had learned to trust these instincts years ago. They had never been wrong. The traders did not announce themselves. They never did. They arrived under the guise of business, unrelated to Claire. Men who claimed to be looking for livestock, for labor, for inventory. But their eyes told a different story. They cataloged people the way others cataloged goods, lingering on features, on skin tone, on bone structure. When their eyes found Claire, they did not move on quickly. Marie noticed how their gazes changed. Not curiosity, assessment. One man asked casually about her age. Another commented on her hair, calling it unusual. A third smiled in a way that made Marie's skin crawl. The kind of smile that suggested ownership before consent was even imagined. Marie placed herself between them and Claire whenever she could, her posture rigid, her presence unmistakable. But protection has limits when power does not belong to you. The word spread quietly. Fancy. It was never spoken in front of Claire, but she heard it anyway. She heard it the way one hears a door close in another room, sensing the change even without seeing it. She did not know exactly what it meant, but she knew it was dangerous. Marie knew exactly what it meant. She had seen girls disappear before. Not taken violently, not screaming. Taken with paperwork, with signatures, with language that disguised cruelty as commerce. Those girls were spoken of later, in past tense, or not at all. Their absence became normal. The realization settled into Marie like poison. Claire was being evaluated, not as a person, as an asset. She began moving with urgency now, though she tried to hide it. She spoke to other women in fragments, testing what they knew, what they feared. Some looked away, some warned her quietly. A few told her the truth without softening it. "They're asking about her," one woman said. "They know." That was all Marie needed to hear. She began preparing Claire, without ever naming the threat. She instructed her not to speak to strangers, not to answer questions, not to wander. Claire bristled at the restrictions but obeyed. She could feel the danger too now, even if she did not yet understand its full shape. The men returned. This time, one of them asked directly to see Claire again, pretending interest in her skills, her temperament. Marie refused without raising her voice. Refusal was a risk, but compliance was worse. The man's smile tightened. He nodded, as if amused by resistance. Later that day, Marie was called aside by someone with authority. The conversation was polite, calm, framed as concern. Claire, she was told, had potential. Her appearance made her valuable. Valuable meant profitable. Profitable meant decisions would be made. Marie felt the room tilt. She argued the only way she could, quietly, persistently, invoking utility, stability, anything that might delay the inevitable. She did not mention love. Love carried no weight here. The answer she received was not final, but it was clear enough. Claire's future was being discussed in rooms Marie would never enter. When she returned to the cabin, Claire was sitting on the floor, braiding a piece of cloth the way Marie had taught her years ago. The sight nearly broke her. Marie sat beside her and pulled her close, breathing her in as if committing her to memory. "They were asking about me," Claire said softly. Marie did not deny it. "What does it mean?" Claire asked. Marie hesitated. Then she chose truth, stripped of detail but heavy with meaning. "It means some people don't see you the way I do." Claire nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. That night, Marie did not sleep. She planned. She weighed impossible options. Each path led to loss, just in different forms. Escape meant pursuit. Hiding meant exposure. Compliance meant destruction. Claire lay awake too, listening to her mother's breathing, sensing the shift in her world. For the first time, she understood that her body itself had become currency, that no amount of obedience or invisibility could change how others saw her. By morning, Marie knew that time had collapsed. The window she had feared was closing. The traders would return, and when they did, they would not be asking. This was the moment Marie had spent her entire life dreading, the moment when love alone could no longer protect her child. And the system moved in to claim what it believed belonged to it. And she knew, with devastating clarity, that whatever happened next would change everything. The traders came back sooner than Marie expected, not days later, the very next morning, as if her fear had summoned them, as if hesitation itself had been interpreted as weakness. Marie saw them from the doorway of the cabin, their figures moving with casual certainty, already convinced the matter was settled. This time they did not pretend curiosity. One of them spoke to the overseer, while the others waited, their eyes drifting inevitably toward Claire. Claire felt it like heat on her skin. She stood close to Marie, her body rigid, her hands clenched so tightly her fingers ached. She did not cry. She did not move. Something in her understood that stillness was the last defense she had. Marie felt the weight of the moment press down on her chest until breathing became an effort. This was the point of no return. The moment when delay turned into defiance, and defiance carried consequences. She was summoned. Not asked, summoned. The conversation was brief and stripped of pretense. Claire had drawn interest. Interest meant money. Money meant decision. Marie's objections were acknowledged the way one acknowledges bad weather. Unfortunate, but irrelevant. "She'll be treated well," one man said, as if that erased everything else. Marie stared at him, unable to mask the disgust that rose in her throat. Treated well was what people said when they needed to believe cruelty could be made acceptable through comfort. Treated well had never protected anyone like her. She's a child, Marie said. The man did not argue. He didn't need to. The system had already decided that childhood was conditional. When Marie returned to the cabin, she closed the door and leaned against it, her legs trembling. Claire watched her carefully, her face pale but composed. "They're going to take me," Claire said. It was not a question. Marie crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled her into her arms. She held her the way she had when Claire was small, as if force alone could anchor her in place. Claire pressed her face into Marie's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent, trying to memorize it. "I won't let them," Marie whispered, though even as she said it, she knew the lie in those words. The truth was unbearable. Marie could fight, but she could not win. Resistance would not save Claire. It would only mark her as difficult, reduce whatever limited protection delay might offer. Marie had spent years teaching Claire how to survive. Now, survival demanded something unthinkable. She began to speak slowly, choosing each word as if it might be the last. "If they take you," she said, "you must remember who you are. Not what they call you, not what they want you to be." Claire pulled back slightly, her eyes wide. "Are you saying goodbye?" Marie swallowed hard. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in. "I'm saying whatever happens, you carry me with you," she said. "They can't take that." Claire shook her head, panic breaking through her composure. "I don't want to go, I want to stay with you." Marie cupped her face in her hands, forcing Claire to meet her eyes. "Listen to me," she said fiercely. "You are not something they own, even if they try to make it so." These were dangerous words, words that could not change reality, but could shape how Claire endured it. When they came for her, it was done efficiently. No raised voices, no spectacle. Efficiency was how systems avoided conscience. Marie was allowed to stand there as Claire was led away, as if proximity could soften the violence of separation. Claire turned back once, just once. Her face held something Marie had never seen before. Not fear, not confusion, but clarity. She understood now, not just what was happening to her, but why it had always been possible. Marie stood motionless until Claire disappeared from view. Only then did her body give in. She sank to the floor, the sound that escaped her somewhere between a sob and a scream, too broken to be either fully. The cabin felt empty in a way Marie had never known. Not quiet, hollow, as if the world itself had removed something essential and left behind a shell. Days passed, then weeks. Marie learned to function again because she had no choice. She worked, she ate, she breathed. Survival demanded routine, even when meaning was gone. But everything she did now carried the echo of absence. Every corner of the cabin reminded her of Claire. Every night stretched endlessly. She heard rumors, hints of where Claire might have been taken. None of them offered comfort. Marie understood now that the worst cruelty was not uncertainty. It was knowing exactly what kind of future awaited her child and being powerless to intervene. The system closed ranks quickly. The matter was considered resolved. Claire was no longer discussed openly. Silence returned, heavy and enforced. Marie was expected to accept it. She never did. Something in her hardened permanently after that day. Not into bitterness, but into resolve. She carried Claire with her, in memory, in defiance, in the quiet refusal to forget. Forgetting would have been easier. Forgetting would have allowed her to survive without pain. But Marie chose pain instead. Years later, people would speak of girls like Claire as commodities, as anomalies, as unfortunate circumstances. They would never speak of the mother left behind, carrying the weight of a love severed by legality. This was the true cost. Not just the taking of a child, but the deliberate erasure of the bond that made her human in the first place. And even then, even after everything, Marie believed one thing with absolute certainty, that Claire remembered her. That somewhere, beneath whatever name she was forced to answer to, beneath whatever life was imposed on her, Claire carried the truth of who she was. That belief did not save Marie, but it kept her alive. Time did not soften Marie's grief. It reorganized it. The sharpness dulled just enough to make survival possible, but the pain settled deeper, becoming part of how she moved through the world. People mistook that for healing. It was not. It was adaptation. The plantation learned quickly how to behave around her. No one mentioned Claire's name. No one asked how Marie was doing. Her loss was treated as an inconvenience, best managed through silence. Sympathy was dangerous. It invited questions. Questions invited responsibility. Marie returned to work because there was no alternative. Her hands learned the motions again, though they no longer carried purpose. Each task felt detached from meaning, performed by muscle memory rather than intention. At night, the cabin remained unbearably quiet. Marie sometimes caught herself listening for footsteps that would never return, for a voice she would never hear again. She replayed her last moments with Claire endlessly. The words she had chosen, the ones she hadn't. The look on Claire's face when understanding finally settled. That look haunted her more than fear ever had. It was the look of someone who knows they are being taken, not because they are guilty, but because they are valuable. Marie refused to let that knowledge turn into shame. She spoke Claire's name aloud when she was alone, anchoring it in the world so it would not disappear. She repeated it like a prayer, like a promise. Names mattered. Names meant existence. Years passed. The system shifted in small ways that were announced as progress. Laws were debated. Rhetoric softened. None of it touched Marie's reality. Whatever future reforms came, they arrived too late for Claire. Justice delayed beyond relevance was not justice at all. Occasionally, Marie heard fragments. A trader mentioning a girl with light hair. A woman whispering about a house in the city where girls were kept. Nothing could be confirmed. Nothing could be acted upon. The uncertainty was its own cruelty, reopening wounds that never fully closed. Marie aged faster after Claire was taken. Grief did that. It carved lines into her face and stooped her posture. But something in her eyes hardened into permanence. She no longer looked away from injustice. She no longer pretended not to see. Even when silence was expected, her presence carried quiet accusation. Other women noticed. Younger ones sought her out, not for comfort, but for guidance. Marie spoke carefully, never inciting rebellion, but never endorsing submission either. She taught them what she could. How to protect what little they had. How to recognize danger early. How to survive without surrendering entirely. This was the only legacy Marie could claim. Far away, Claire grew into a woman whose life was shaped by negotiation. Every day demanded calculation. How much visibility was safe? Which version of herself would be tolerated? Which truths must remain buried? She learned how to smile without warmth, how to endure without hope, how to survive without belonging. Her appearance continued to define her fate. It opened doors and locked others. It invited both privilege and exploitation, often from the same people. Claire learned early that proximity to power did not equal protection. It only meant proximity. She carried her mother with her in ways no one could see, in the refusal to forget her own worth, in the quiet defiance of small choices, in the memories she revisited when nights became unbearable. Marie's voice lived in her head, steady and firm, reminding her that what others claimed did not define who she was. Claire never stopped wondering if her mother was alive. That uncertainty never faded. It accompanied her into adulthood, shaping her relationships, her silences, her guardedness. Love, for Claire, always carried the risk of loss. Eventually, the world changed in ways neither of them had lived to imagine. Slavery ended. Laws shifted. Names were rewritten into records that pretended history could be corrected through paperwork. For some, freedom arrived as transformation. For others, it arrived too late to repair what had already been destroyed. Claire, if she lived to see it, stood at the edge of a society that did not know where to place her. Too marked by the past to belong fully to the future. Too shaped by exploitation to trust its promises. She existed, as she always had, in between. Marie did not live to see those changes. Her body gave out quietly, worn down by years of labor and grief. She died without recognition, without ceremony, but she did not die erased. The women who had learned from her remembered her. They carried her lessons forward. They spoke her name. This is how history actually survives. Not in court decisions or official records, but in memory passed from one person to another, in warnings whispered, in truths preserved despite effort to destroy them. The story of Marie and Claire was never meant to be told. It existed in the margins, in the spaces where legality replaced morality, and silence replaced accountability. But it mattered. Not because it was unique, but because it was not. There were many Maries, many Claires, many children whose lives were shaped by systems that refused to recognize their humanity. Their suffering was not accidental. It was engineered. It was legal. And that was the most horrifying part. This is not a story about a single crime. It is a story about a structure that allowed crimes to exist without names, without consequences, without remorse. A system that protected itself by denying personhood to those it exploited. The horror was never just what happened to Claire. The horror was that it was allowed to happen at all. And that for generations, it did. Claire learned that some memories don't belong to the past. They wait. They surface when the world slows down, when the noise thins, when there is nothing left to distract her from herself. In those moments, it wasn't the places she remembered or the faces. It was the feeling of being held without conditions. The certainty that someone in the world knew exactly who she was and chose her anyway. She tried for years to protect that memory by not touching it too often. Some things break if you handle them too much. But it always returned on its own. The weight of a hand on her back, a voice lowering when the world felt dangerous, a presence that made fear feel manageable. She never knew what became of her mother. There was no confirmation, no ending she could point to. Only absence stretched thin across time. Claire learned to live inside that uncertainty, to carry it the way one carries a quiet ache, never gone, never fully consuming, simply there. Marie's love became something Claire had to reconstruct from fragments. A tone, a posture, the way strength could exist without cruelty. When Claire was forced to make herself smaller, she remembered that once she had been allowed to take up space. When she was told who she was, she remembered who had named her first. Some nights, Claire spoke that name out loud. Not loudly, not in grief, just enough to remind herself that it still existed somewhere in the world. Marie, for her part, lived the rest of her life with a wound that never closed. Time dulled its edges, but never filled the space it left behind. She learned how to move through days that no longer held anticipation. She stopped imagining outcomes and focused only on endurance. But even as her body weakened, her love did not shift or fade. It stayed fixed, unchanged, waiting without expectation. In her final days, Marie thought less about loss and more about presence, about the weight of a child against her chest, about the quiet moments that had once seemed ordinary and now felt impossibly precious. She did not ask the world to be fair. She asked only that Claire had survived. When Marie died, there was no witness to mark the moment, no words spoken aloud. But if love leaves any imprint at all, it was there, in the stillness, in the fact that her final thought was not of herself. Claire never felt the moment her mother was gone. But one night, long after, she woke with a sudden sense of grounding, as if something that had been holding her from a distance had finally settled inside her instead. She did not understand it. She only knew that the loneliness felt different, quieter. She placed her hand over her heart and stayed there until the feeling passed. Nothing had been returned to her. Nothing had been repaired. But something had endured, and that was enough. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the moment it learned how to hide.